In the winter of 1944, the Pacific Ocean was no longer a vast blue divide. It had become a graveyard. Steel hulls lay torn open on the ocean floor, and aircraft littered island jungles from Saipan to the Philippines. Across that endless expanse of sea, a small group of men, Japanese prisoners of war, were being transported toward a land they had been told was ruled by demons. They sat in silence aboard a U.S. transport ship, bound for a prisoner camp somewhere in the American Midwest. The cold wind cut through the deck, and many of them still carried the salt and grime of battle. Their uniforms were in tatters, their spirits fractured. Some had been captured after weeks hiding in caves or jungles, expecting to die rather than surrender. Others had been pulled half-conscious from burning wrecks. Surrender was not a word the Imperial Japanese Army permitted. It was a stain worse than death. But these men were alive, and that, in itself, was its own kind of torment. For weeks they had been fed sparingly. Rice balls, canned beans, sometimes a bit of bread. The guards spoke little Japanese, but their tone was calm. The POWs expected cruelty. They had been told that Americans tortured captives, starved them, made them dig their own graves. Instead, the guards seemed indifferent, efficient but not cruel. They offered cigarettes, occasionally smiled, and ensured medical care for the wounded. It was disorienting. As the ship approached the west coast, the men stared at the American shoreline through narrow eyes. The mountains behind San Francisco shimmered faintly under the winter light. Some of them whispered prayers. They expected jeers, crowds, humiliation. But when they were marched off the ship, there were no mobs, no taunts, just a handful of soldiers with clipboards, trucks waiting to carry them inland, and the endless noise of an industrial nation at war. Their journey eastward by train took days. They were instructed not to look out of the windows, but many did. What they saw was unlike anything they had imagined. Clean towns, endless fields, factories glowing even at night. America was not the ruined, starving nation their officers had described. It was alive, immense, and impossibly wealthy. The prisoners whispered among themselves, if this was the enemy, how could Japan ever hope to win? When the train finally slowed outside a small town in Wisconsin, the prisoners saw snow for the first time in their lives. The cold bit into their skin, but the landscape was serene. White fields, wooden barns, pine trees heavy with frost. A sign read Camp McCoy. It was to be their new world. They were searched, deloused, and given clean uniforms marked with large PW stencils. Inside the barracks, bunks were lined in perfect order, each with a blanket and pillow. They noticed something strange: silence. There were no shouts, no guards striking men with rifle butts, no screaming officers. The Americans gave orders, but always in the same firm, even tone. They were told they would work during the day, attend roll call twice, and were free to write letters through the Red Cross. The rules were strict, but fair. At first, many thought it was a trick. They refused to eat the food, fearing poison. Others stayed awake at night, expecting punishment. But nothing came. Days passed, then weeks. The men began to understand that this was not cruelty, it was discipline of a different kind. In Japan, they had been taught that mercy toward the enemy was weakness. Yet here, the enemy offered blankets when the temperature dropped. American medics treated their frostbite, changed their bandages, and gave them aspirin. The shock was quiet but deep. The first meal that broke them came on a Sunday afternoon. Snow was falling outside, and the mess hall smelled of grease and smoke. The Americans had decided to serve the same food for everyone, guards and prisoners alike. The menu was simple: hamburgers, fried potatoes, and something many of the Japanese had never seen before: a dark, bubbling drink poured from glass bottles that hissed when opened. At first, they didn't move. The hamburger sat on their metal trays, warm, soft, and aromatic. Some poked it cautiously with their forks, others sniffed. The scent of meat and onion filled the hall. The Americans around them ate casually, laughing, talking, not thinking much of it. One of the prisoners, a former mechanic from Nagasaki, finally took a bite. He froze, then chewed slowly. Another followed. Soon the sound of tentative eating filled the hall. For men who had spent months living on half-cooked rice and muddy water, the taste was almost too much. Fat, salt, warmth. It was overwhelming. Some of them laughed suddenly, nervous and embarrassed. A few began to cry silently, their shoulders trembling. The guards looked on, confused but respectful. No one said a word. Then came the drink, the Coca-Cola. The bottles were cold to the touch, beaded with condensation. When they sipped it, the fizz hit their tongues like electricity. It was sweet, almost painfully so, a flavor that seemed impossible in wartime. They looked at one another in disbelief. A few whispered the word Ushotski, liar, under their breath, as if refusing to believe this was real. That night, one of the prisoners wrote in his small notebook, "Today we ate the food of the enemy. It was warm, it was kind, and it broke something inside me." The next morning, the guards noticed a change. The prisoners worked more quietly, but with a new kind of focus. They began asking for English words, trying to learn, "Thank you," "Good morning," "Water." They began to understand that America's power did not come only from machines or weapons. It came from abundance, from the ability to feed even its captives. In Tokyo, propaganda continued to paint the Americans as monsters. But here, in this camp in Wisconsin, the prisoners were beginning to see a contradiction that shook their understanding of the world. If the enemy was capable of kindness, what had all their suffering been for?
The cultural shock went beyond food. The POWs were assigned to work in nearby lumber mills and farms, under supervision but not cruelty. American farmers sometimes waved at them. Children stared from porches, wide-eyed but unafraid. Occasionally, local women would leave small packages near the road, soap, fruit, even letters of peace. The Japanese men did not know how to respond. They bowed deeply, sometimes too deeply, unsure what was permitted. Among them was Sergeant Akira Nakamura, once a proud non-commissioned officer in the Imperial Army. In the early months of captivity, he refused to speak, eat, or participate. He had sworn an oath to die for the emperor, and now he was a prisoner, alive but dishonored. Yet after that meal, something inside him began to change. One day, he was assigned to cut firewood alongside an American private from Kansas. The private offered him a cigarette. Nakamura hesitated, then accepted. They worked in silence for hours, side by side, exchanging only glances and gestures. When they finished, the American clapped him on the shoulder. No words were spoken, but the gesture said everything. That night, Nakamura sat by the window of his barracks, looking out at the snow. He remembered his training, the speeches about the divine mission of Japan, the purity of sacrifice, the cruelty of Western devils. Yet here, in the land of those supposed devils, he saw decency, he saw order, he saw humanity. Over time, the camp became a strange mirror of discipline. The Japanese prisoners organized cleaning duties, held small study groups, even staged music performances using makeshift instruments. The guards encouraged it. They said it kept morale high. For the Japanese, it became a way to survive with dignity. One of the strangest aspects was how the Americans handled punishment. In the Imperial Army, disobedience was met with beatings or worse. Here, a man who broke a rule might be confined for a few days, given a warning, then returned to work. The logic was alien, but undeniable. It worked. The men began to obey not out of fear, but respect. Letters eventually began to arrive from home through the Red Cross. They were heavily censored, but they carried fragments of truth. Bombings in Tokyo, food shortages, families displaced. The prisoners realized that while they slept on clean sheets and ate meat, their families starved under firebombs. It filled them with guilt. Some wept openly. Others prayed. But none could deny the bitter irony. In captivity, they were safer and better fed than they had ever been in uniform. In the spring of 1945, as snow melted and the fields around Camp McCoy turned green, news trickled in. Okinawa had fallen, and Japan's situation was desperate. The prisoners listened to the guards' radios, straining to understand the English broadcasts. They knew the end was coming. One evening, the mess hall served hamburgers again. This time, no one hesitated. They ate quietly, reverently almost. The simple meal had become a symbol, a reminder that the world they had been taught to hate might not be what it seemed. By now, the Americans had grown accustomed to their guests. Some guards even played baseball with the POWs on weekends. It was surreal. Men who months earlier had tried to kill each other, now sharing laughter over a game. The sound of bats striking ball echoed across the camp, mingling with the shouts of "safe" and "out" in 2 languages. When summer came, new prisoners arrived, men captured in the Philippines, emaciated and hollow-eyed. They looked at the older group with suspicion. "You've gone soft," one hissed in Japanese. "You're eating the enemy's food." The veterans of Camp McCoy said nothing. They only gestured toward the kitchen, where the smell of hamburgers was already spreading. That night, the new arrivals ate in silence. A few resisted, but hunger is stronger than pride. When they finally tasted the food, their expressions changed. The walls around their hearts cracked just a little. By mid-1945, many of the prisoners had begun keeping journals. Some drew sketches of the camp, its fences, the pine forests, the barracks, aligned like soldiers. Others wrote reflections. "We were ready to die for our emperor, but it seems life has taught us another kind of courage." They began to see that the war was more than guns and flags. It was a collision of worlds. Japan had fought for honor, for empire, for ideals carved into myth. America fought with machines, with production, with practicality. And somehow, through its sheer efficiency, America could afford to show mercy. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola became more than food. They were symbols of that mercy. Sweetness and warmth in a time of chaos. For men raised in a culture that revered suffering, this gentleness was unbearable. It stripped them of the armor they had built over years of indoctrination. It made them human again. When word finally came in August that Japan had surrendered after the atomic bombings, the camp fell silent. No one cheered. The Japanese prisoners sat motionless for hours, staring at the floor. Some prayed softly, others simply wept. Their nation was gone, their emperor defeated, but they were alive. And perhaps somewhere deep inside, they understood that survival was not shameful. That night, the mess hall served hamburgers once again. For the last time as captives, they ate in silence, each bite heavy with memory. Some would later say that the taste of that meal, the sweetness of Coca-Cola, the salt of fried potatoes, was the moment they truly understood the war was over. The war that promised them glory had ended not in battle, but in kindness. And in that contradiction lay the deepest wound of all.
The surrender of Japan in August 1945 changed everything, but inside the barbed wire fences of Camp McCoy, time seemed to slow. The prisoners awoke the next morning to a world that no longer existed. The empire they had sworn their lives to had vanished overnight, erased by words broadcast over shortwave radio. Many didn't believe it at first. Some whispered that it was propaganda. But the Americans confirmed it quietly. The emperor himself had spoken. For most of the Japanese soldiers, the reality of surrender struck harder than any battlefield defeat. To them, surrender meant spiritual annihilation. They had been raised on tales of Bushido, of warriors who would rather die by their own blade than yield. Now, as they sat on the bunks of their Wisconsin barracks, they faced an unthinkable truth. They were survivors of a nation that had chosen life over death. In the following days, the camp's atmosphere shifted. Guards noticed the prisoners moving slower, speaking less. Some wept openly for the first time, not out of fear, but from the weight of realization. The sound of the American flag fluttering outside seemed to echo louder than usual. The Americans treated them the same as before. No mockery, no lectures. Meals continued, work assignments remained, baseball games still played on Sundays. But to the Japanese, every act of kindness now carried a different meaning. The enemy who had defeated them did not gloat. The guard seemed almost sympathetic. One afternoon, the camp's loudspeakers played the American national anthem before a ceremony for the end of hostilities. The Japanese prisoners stood silently behind the fence, watching the guards salute. Sergeant Akira Nakamura felt something shift inside him. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling: pride, unity, purpose. The same things he had once believed Japan held alone. Weeks later, news reached the camp about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The men gathered in stunned silence as an interpreter translated reports of a single bomb destroying entire cities. For hours, no one spoke. Then one man muttered, "The gods have abandoned us." Another whispered, "Perhaps they never existed." In those moments, the hamburgers in Coca-Cola from months earlier returned to their minds. They realized that America's power wasn't just in weapons, it was in creation, not destruction. It could feed, build, and rebuild even while waging war. That was the true might of their enemy. By the fall of 1945, many prisoners began to assist in the camp's administration. They volunteered to help with cleaning, cooking, and translation for new arrivals. For them, work became a kind of redemption. Some started English classes run by American chaplains. They practiced phrases carefully: "Thank you very much," "peace," "friendship." Words that once sounded foreign now carried weight. Letters from Japan trickled in more frequently. They spoke of devastation, burned cities, empty rice fields, families displaced. Some prisoners learned their parents had died in bombings. Others discovered that their villages had been erased entirely. In that grief, the contradictions of war deepened. They were alive in enemy hands while their loved ones perished at home. Survival became both a blessing and a wound. The Americans, understanding your pain, began to organize cultural exchanges within the camp. Chaplains and officers encouraged discussions about rebuilding, democracy, and human rights. They didn't lecture, they shared ideas. For the Japanese, it was the first exposure to the concept that freedom could exist without hierarchy, that obedience could coexist with dignity. Akira Nakamura often joined these discussions. When asked what he wanted to do after repatriation, he hesitated. "I don't know if I have a home to return to," he said softly. The American officer replied, "Then build one." Those words would stay with him for decades.
Not all prisoners adapted easily. A small group of hardliners still clung to the old ideology. They refused to learn English, refused to smile, and spoke bitterly about shame. To them, the hamburgers and Coca-Cola were not kindness, they were humiliation disguised as mercy. They saw the camp's comfort as an attempt to weaken their spirit, yet even they could not resist hunger or curiosity forever. When offered food, they ate. When offered warmth, they accepted it in silence. Slowly, the walls around them began to crumble. In December 1945, the Red Cross arranged for some prisoners to be repatriated. The day of departure was bittersweet. Snow covered the camp once again, just as it had when they first arrived. The Americans lined up near the trucks, offering cigarettes, chocolate, and handshakes. Many prisoners bowed deeply, some even saluting their guards. One man said in broken English, "Thank you for not killing us." The guard replied, "War's over. Go live your life." As the trucks rolled away, Akira looked back at the barracks. Smoke rose gently from the mess hall chimney. The memory of that first hamburger came to him again. The taste, the confusion, the tears. He realized then that what had broken them wasn't defeat, it was compassion. The journey back to Japan was silent. On the ship, the men stood on deck as the Pacific stretched endlessly before them, the same ocean they had once crossed as conquerors. When the coastline of their homeland finally appeared, many fell to their knees. But what awaited them was not the Japan they remembered. The ports were shattered, the cities unrecognizable. Families met them with mixed emotions: relief, guilt, sometimes shame. Former officers avoided their gaze. Surrender had erased all status. In the ruins of Tokyo, the smell of ash hung in the air. The prisoners realized that the war they had survived had consumed everything they had once fought for. Yet in the midst of destruction, small signs of rebirth emerged. American trucks moved through the streets, delivering supplies. Children followed them, laughing when soldiers tossed candy from the back. Coca-Cola signs appeared on street corners. It was surreal. The same symbols of enemy indulgence now marked the beginning of recovery. Akira Nakamura found work rebuilding rail lines. Each day he watched American engineers coordinating with Japanese laborers, teaching, repairing, sharing tools. He couldn't hate them anymore. He still felt loyalty to his country, but he also understood that hatred had no future. One evening, he walked past a makeshift canteen where American GIs were drinking. One of them noticed him, smiled, and offered a bottle. Akira hesitated, then accepted. It was Coca-Cola. He took a sip, and the same fizzy sweetness from that winter day in Wisconsin filled his mouth. This time he didn't cry. He simply nodded in gratitude. Across Japan, thousands of former POWs carried similar memories. They had lived through the worst of war, but it was small, human gestures, the warmth of food, the absence of cruelty, that stayed with them longest. Many would later write about it in memoirs, calling it their awakening. Historians today still debate the motives behind the U.S. treatment of Japanese POWs. Some argue it was pure pragmatism. Healthy, cooperative prisoners made good workers and propaganda tools. Others believe it reflected a deeper American belief in order, discipline, and moral strength. Perhaps both are true. Whatever the reason, the effect was undeniable. Compassion became a weapon stronger than bullets. The psychological transformation of those men rippled through post-war Japan. When the occupation government began rebuilding society, it found surprising allies among former soldiers who had seen America up close. They had witnessed a different kind of power, the kind that could forgive. These men became teachers, engineers, reformers. Quietly, they helped rebuild their country not in defiance of the West, but alongside it. Years later, Akira Nakamura would tell his grandson about his time in the camp. He said, "They fed us like human beings, and that was what defeated us." The boy asked him if he hated America. Akira smiled faintly. "No," he replied, "because they showed me that kindness can conquer too." The story of Japanese prisoners tasting hamburgers and Coca-Cola in captivity became a small footnote in the brand history of World War II. But for those who lived it, it marked the moment they rediscovered their humanity. The enemy's food had not just filled their stomachs, it had dismantled years of indoctrination, replacing it with something fragile but enduring: understanding. In the years that followed, the world would divide again: Cold War, Korea, Vietnam. But for those former POWs, the lesson of that winter never faded. Mercy, they realized, could be more subversive than violence. It could reshape nations. The snow had long since melted in Wisconsin, and Camp McCoy returned to quiet training grounds. Yet somewhere in its soil lingered the memory of that unlikely encounter, where warriors prepared for death were undone not by guns, but by warmth, flavor, and humanity.
Years turned into decades, but the memory of captivity never left the men who had lived through it. What began as humiliation had evolved into reflection. For the Japanese soldiers who once trembled before hamburgers and Coca-Cola, the taste of those things would forever remain tied to the most profound contradiction of their lives: that the enemy who defeated them had treated them with humanity. In post-war Japan, silence surrounded the experience of prisoners. They had survived, but survival itself was seen as shameful. Many returned home to find families who avoided speaking of the war altogether. To be a POW was to carry a secret, a scar invisible but heavy. The Japanese code of honor had left no place for men who surrendered. Yet, deep within them, these former prisoners carried stories that challenged everything that ideology had stood for. By the 1950s, Japan had begun its miraculous economic recovery. American factories collaborated with Japanese manufacturers. Students studied English in classrooms rebuilt with U.S. funds. In Tokyo, neon lights replaced bombed-out ruins, and the hum of commerce filled the air. But for men like Akira Nakamura, who worked as a railway supervisor, the post-war miracle wasn't only about machines or money. It was about values, discipline without cruelty, pride without hatred. Lessons he had learned, strangely enough, inside an American POW camp. He often spoke to younger workers about respect, fairness, and hard work. When they asked where he had learned such patience, he smiled and said, "In Wisconsin." They would laugh, thinking he was joking, but he wasn't. In the heart of enemy territory, under guard, he had learned what true order looked like. Not the kind enforced by fear, but by principle. Across Japan, stories like his slowly began to surface. Former soldiers who had been held in America shared memories in quiet veterans gatherings. They described clean beds, fair treatment, and strange foods that had made them cry. One man recalled his first sip of Coca-Cola as like tasting the future. Another said that the hamburger he ate on Christmas Eve in the camp was the moment I realized my country had lost, not because we were weak, but because we misunderstood what strength truly was. Historians who later studied these accounts found a pattern. American POW policy, guided by the Geneva Convention, wasn't perfect, but it contrasted sharply with the brutality seen in other theaters of war. In the Pacific, Japanese captives were few because most chose death over capture. Those who survived often did so by accident, unconscious, wounded, or too weak to resist. Yet, the United States treated them with surprising restraint. It was not only morality, it was strategy. American commanders believed that good treatment of POWs would encourage future surrenders, saving lives on both sides. But in doing so, they also triggered something far deeper, a quiet revolution of conscience. By the 1960s, American and Japanese veterans began meeting at peace conferences. At one such event in 1964, a translator introduced two men, an American guard who had served at Camp McCoy and a Japanese former prisoner who once feared him. They shook hands, then embraced. The moment was captured by a journalist and printed under the headline, "Enemies No More." The photograph circulated widely, symbolizing reconciliation not written in treaties but in memory. When asked what he remembered most from the camp, the Japanese veteran said, "The food. It tasted of mercy." As time went on, these stories reached younger generations who had grown up in the shadow of peace. For them, hamburgers and Coca-Cola were not symbols of surrender, but of modern life. They were part of Japan's new identity, a nation reborn through resilience, open to the world. Yet for those who had first tasted them in captivity, the sweetness carried something sacred. The moment they realized that even in defeat, they could find dignity. In the late 1970s, Akira Nakamura, then an old man, returned to the United States with a group of veterans. They were invited to visit former POW sites, many of which had long since closed or been repurposed. When Akira stepped onto the grounds of Camp McCoy, he found only wind, grass, and faint outlines of the barracks. But in his mind, he could still hear the clang of the mess hall trays, the laughter during baseball games, the quiet murmur of men rediscovering themselves. A local historian approached, and asked through an interpreter, "What do you remember most?" Akira looked around and smiled faintly. "The snow," he said, "and the kindness that melted it." Later that day, he joined the historian for lunch at a small diner nearby. When the waitress brought them hamburgers and cokes, Akira paused. He lifted the glass, looked through the bubbles rising in the drink, and whispered in English, "To peace." He took a sip. The same sharp sweetness that had once overwhelmed him now tasted like closure. When he returned to Japan, he wrote a short memoir titled The Taste of Peace. It never became famous, but it was passed among students, veterans, and historians for decades. In it, he wrote, "They fed us when they did not have to. They showed us mercy when we expected death. In that mercy, I found the truth that war hides, that even enemies can teach us how to live." As the years passed, others followed his example. Former POWs began recording oral histories, often through university projects. Their voices, trembling with age, described small human moments amid the machinery of war. A guard sharing a cigarette, a nurse treating a wound, a meal that tasted like forgiveness. Some of these stories were later adapted into documentaries and books. Viewers around the world were stunned to learn how compassion, not violence, had left the deepest mark on those men. Historians began to call it the psychological disarmament of the Japanese POWs. It was not achieved through force, but through humanity. Today, when visitors tour Camp McCoy, still an active military training site, few know its full history. But on quiet winter mornings, when the snow falls across the fields, it's easy to imagine the ghosts of that time. Young men far from home, shivering in a strange land, discovering that kindness could be stronger than any weapon. Modern Japan's alliance with the United States stands as one of the closest partnerships in the world. Trade, defense, culture. Two nations that once destroyed each other now build together. Somewhere in that vast transformation lies the echo of a simple moment. A group of hungry soldiers tasting hamburgers and Coca-Cola for the first time, realizing that mercy had defeated hatred. Those men would go on to teach their children and grandchildren that peace is not weakness, it is wisdom earned through pain. And so the story lives on, not in textbooks or grand monuments, but in small gestures, a shared meal, a handshake, a word of understanding. Because sometimes history's greatest victories are not won on battlefields, but at dinner tables. The war ended long ago, but its quietest lesson remains timeless. Even in the darkest chapters, humanity can still shine through. Thank you for watching this documentary. If you felt moved by this story, don't forget to subscribe for more Untold WWII histories. Like this video to support the channel, and comment your favorite part below. We'd love to know what moment touched you most. And of course, share this story with others who believe that even in war, compassion has the power to change the world.